Good evening. It's the third day of Hanukkah, and hope you're having a wonderful Hanukkah. And I'm going to read chapter 7 in Josephus's book on the Antiquities of the Jews. It's chapter 12, book 12, chapter 7. How Judas overthrew the forces of Apollonius and Seron and killed the generals of their armies, and how when, a little while after Lysias and Gorgias were defeated, he went up to Jerusalem and purified the temple. 1. When Apollonius, the general of the Samaritan forces, heard this, he took his army and made haste to go against Judas, who made him and joined battle against him. Now this is Judas Maccabees. This is not Judas who betrayed Jesus. This is 175 years or so before, who met him and joined battle against him and defeated him and killed many of his men. Among them was Apollonius, their general, and took his sword for his own. Even so he wounded far more than he killed in battle, and took a great deal of servants away from the enemy's camp, and then went his way. So when Seron, who was general of the army of Syria, heard that many had joined themselves to Judas, and that he had an army sufficient enough for fighting and for making war, he determined to make an expedition against him, believing it reflected well upon him to punish those who transgressed the king's decrees. He then got together an army, as large as he was able, and joined it with the lawless and wicked Jews, and came against Judas. He came as far as Beth Horon, a village of Judea, and there pitched his camp, upon which Judas met him. This is like somewhat of a civil war, because Judas Maccabeus is a very zealous Jew who believes in the laws of God, whereas the wicked Jews were actually allied with Antiochus and Epiphanes, who was the ruler of Jerusalem at that time, a foreign ruler. Then when Seron intended to engage him in battle, Judas saw that his soldiers were unwilling to fight, because their numbers were small, and because they wanted food, for they were hungry. He encouraged them and said that victory and conquest of enemies are not achieved from the number of armies, but in the exercise of devotion towards God. They had the examples of their own forefathers, who by their righteousness, by exerting themselves on behalf of their own laws and their own children, had frequently conquered many tens of thousands, for innocence is the strongest army. By this speech he induced his men to attack the multitude of the enemy, and to fall upon Seron. Upon joining battle against him, he beat the Syrians. So when their general Seron fell among the rest of the slain, they all ran away with speed, thinking that to be the best way of escaping. So Judas pursued them unto the plain and killed about 800 of the enemy, but the rest escaped to the region which lay near to the sea. 2. When King Antiochus heard of these things, he was very angry at what had happened, so he got together his own army, with many mercenaries, whom he had hired from the islands, and took them with him, and prepared to invade Judea about the beginning of the spring. However, upon organizing his soldiers, he perceived that his treasuries were deficient, and there was a lack of money in them, for all the taxes were not paid because of the rebellions that had been among the nations that he had been so honorable and so liberal towards, according to his own opinion. What he had present was not enough for him, so he therefore resolved first to go to Persia and collect the taxes of that country. Before doing so, he left one behind whose name was Lysias, who was considered capable enough to be governor of the kingdom as far as the bounds of Egypt and of the Lower Asia, and reaching from the river Euphrates, and left him in charge of a certain part of his forces and his elephants. King Antiochus charged him to raise his son Antiochus with all possible care until he came back. He demanded that Lysias go and conquer Judea and take its inhabitants for slaves, utterly destroying Jerusalem and abolishing the whole nation. When King Antiochus had given these orders to Lysias, he went into Persia. In the 147th year, he passed over Euphrates and went to the superior provinces. 3. Upon this, Lysias chose Ptolemy, the son of Diormenes, and Nicanor, and Gorgias, very potent men among the king's friends. They arrived with 40,000 foot soldiers, along with 7,000 horsemen. He sent them against Judea, who came as far as the city Emmaus, and pitched their camp in the plain country. There they joined up with the allied forces of Syria, and the country nearby, as well as many of the renegade Jews. With them came several merchants to buy those that should be taken captives, having bonds with them to bind those that should be made prisoners, as well as the silver and gold which they had in order to pay for their price. So, when Judas saw their camp and saw how numerous their enemies were, he persuaded his own soldiers to be of good courage and exhorted them to place their hopes of victory in God and to prayer to him according to the custom of their country while clothed in sackcloth. This was to show what their usual habit of devotion when they had been in the greatest dangers, and to thereby to prevail with God to grant them the victory over their enemies. So he set them in their ancient order of battle used by their forefathers, under captains of thousands and other officers, and dismissed those who were newly married, as well as those who had newly acquired possessions, so that they would not fight in a cowardly manner out of an inordinate love of life, in order to enjoy those blessings. When Judas had thus organized his soldiers, he encouraged them to fight by the following speech which he made to them. Quote, "My fellow soldiers, no other time remains more important than the present for courage and disregard for dangers. For if you now fight like men, you may recover your liberty. Freedom is something agreeable to all men, but is also much more desirable because it gives us the liberty of worshiping God. Since you are in such circumstances at present, you must either recover that liberty, thus regain a happy and blessed way of living, which is according to our laws and the customs of our country, or to submit to the most unbearable sufferings, while no seed of your country will remain if you are beaten in this battle. Fight therefore like men, and assume that you must die. We do not fight for, but believe that besides such glorious rewards, including the liberty of your country, of your laws, of your religion, you shall then obtain everlasting glory. Prepare yourselves, and put yourselves into a proper frame of mind, that you may be ready to fight against the enemy as soon as the sun rises tomorrow morning." 4. This was a speech which Judas made to encourage them. So, when the enemy sent Gorgias with 5,000 foot soldiers and 1,000 of them on horse, so that he might ambush Judas by night, he had for that purpose a certain number of the renegade Jews as guides. However, Judas, the son of Matthias, perceived it beforehand and decided to fall upon those enemies that were in their vicinity now that their forces were divided. After he had eaten and had left many fires burning in their camp, he marched all night to his enemies that were at Emmaus. So when Gorgias found no enemy in their camp, but suspected that they had gone and hidden themselves among the mountains, he resolved to go and hunt them down wherever they were. Around the break of day, Judas appeared to those enemies who were at Emmaus, having only 3,000 men who were ill-equipped by reason of their one poverty. He saw that the enemy very well prepared and skillfully fortified in their camp. So he encouraged the Jews and told them that they ought to fight, though it be with their naked bodies, because God has sometimes in the past given such men strength enough to win, even though they had been against enemies greater in number and better armed also, out of regard to their own courage. So, their great courage. So he commanded the trumpeters to sound for the battle, and by falling upon the enemies when they did not expect it, thereby astonishing and disturbing their minds, he killed many of those that resisted him, pursuing the rest of them as far as Gadara, and the plains of Idumea and Ashdod and Jamnia, where there fell about 3,000. Judas ordered his soldiers not to be too greedy of the spoils, for they still had to battle against Gorgias and the forces that were with him. Once they had overcome them, then they could securely plunder the camp, because they were the only other enemies remaining. Just as he was speaking to his soldiers, Gorgias' men looked down into the portion of the army which they left in their camp, and saw that it had been overthrown and the camp burnt. For the smoke that arose from it showed them, even when they were a great way off, what had happened. When those who were with Gorgias understood that the enemy was behind them, perceiving that those that were with Judas were ready to fight them, they became frightened and began to flee. Then Judas, as though he had already beaten Gorgias' soldiers without fighting, returned and seized on the spoils. He took a great quantity of gold and silver, purple and blue, and returned home with joy, singing hymns to God for their great success, for this victory greatly contributed to the recovery of their freedom. When Lysias 5. When Lysias was confronted with the defeat of the army which he had sent, the next year he got together 60,000 chosen men. He also took 5,000 horsemen and fell upon Judea. He went up to the hill country of Bethsur, a village of Judea, and pitched his camp there, where Judas met him with 10,000 men. When he saw the great number of his enemies, he prayed to God that he would assist him, and joined battle with the first of the enemy that appeared, and defeated them, killing about 5,000 of them, becoming very frightening to the rest of them. When Lysias observed the great spirit of the Jews, how they were prepared to die rather than lose their freedom, and being afraid of their desperate way of fighting as if it were real strength, he took the rest of the army back with him and returned to Antioch. Once there, he enlisted foreigners into the service and prepared to fall upon Judea with a greater army. 6. After the generals of Antiochus' army had been defeated, Judas assembled the people together and told them that after these many victories which God had given them, they ought to go up to Jerusalem to purify the temple and offer the appropriate sacrifices. As soon as he, with all his allies, arrived in Jerusalem and found the temple deserted, with its gates burnt down, and plants growing in the temple of their own accord, on account of its desertion, he and those that were with him began to lament, and were quite confounded at the sight of the temple. So he chose some of his soldiers, and gave them order to fight against those guards that were in the citadel, until he should have purified the temple. When he had carefully purged it, and had brought in new vessels, the candlestick, the table of showbread, and the altar of incense, which were made of gold, he hung up the veils of the gates, and added doors to them. He also took down the altar of burnt offering, and built a new one of stones that is gathered together, and none of them were hewn with iron tools. So, on the 5th and 20th day of the month of Kislev, which the Macedonians call Apollonius, they lit the lamps that were on the candlestick, and offered incense upon the altar of incense, and laid the loaves upon the table of showbread, and offered burnt offerings upon the new altar of burnt offering. Now it turns out that these things were done on the very same day on which the divine worship had fallen off, and was reduced to a profane and common use after 3 years' time. For so it was, that the temple was made desolate by Antiochus, which continued for 3 years. This desolation happened to the temple in the 145th year, on the 25th day of the month of Apollonius, and on the 153rd Olympiad. But it was dedicated anew on the same day, the 25th of the month, Apollonius, on the 148th year, and on the 154th Olympiad. And this desolation came to pass according to the prophecy of Daniel, which was given 408 years before he declared that the Macedonians would dissolve that worship for some time. So this is a fulfillment of a prophecy. 7. Now Judas celebrated the festival of the restoration of the sacrifices of the temple for 8 days, and omitted no sort of pleasures. He feasted upon very rich and splendid sacrifices, and he honored God, and delighted them by hymns and psalms. Nay, They were very glad at the revival of their customs when, after a long time of intermission, they unexpectedly had regained the freedom of their worship, that they made it a law for their posterity, that they should keep a festival on account of the restoration of their temple worship for 8 days. And from that time to this day, we celebrate this festival and call it Lights. I suppose the reason was because this liberty beyond our hopes appeared to us, and that thence was a name given to that festival. Judas also rebuilt the walls around the city and constructed towers of great height against the incursion of enemies, and set guards therein. He also fortified the city Bethsura, that it might serve as a citadel against any threats that might come from our enemies. So this is basically where the story of Hannukah ends. So happy Hannukah, and this is not the biblical, this is not included in the Bible, this is an extra biblical historical story, but it has a very important, it's a very important contribution to the overall biblical history. Oh, the 8 days. Right. I wonder if this does have a little bit more. This doesn't have anything about the, I don't think it has about the 8 days, but there was basically the story with the Hanukkah candles, the Hannukah. I'll bring it over. This is called the Hannukah. And there are, they didn't use candles at the time, okay? They used oil lamps. And they had to press the oil from olives. The olives were, this is holy anointed oil that they would use in the temple to light the eternal flame. And so the candles, or the flame, they only had enough oil for 1 day of that 8-day festival of light. But that 1 day of oil actually kept the candle burning for 8 days. And so that's the miracle of Hanukkah, is this a miracle of the oil. And what? Until they could make more oil. And of course, this is the 3rd day. So this is the shamash, this is the servant's candle, and then there's 4 on one side and 4 on another. So you'll have all these lit by the final day of Hanukkah. And so this is a tradition. It's not one of the the holy days like Pesach or Passover when we have the Passion Week. It's not a Sukkot or any of those holy days, but it is one of the feasts, and I think it's a really important feast. And the reason why it's such an important feast is because the temple was actually cleansed. The temple had been desecrated by the Greeks, by Antiochus Epiphanes, and because it was desecrated, the Judas Maccabees and the Maccabees had to fight this war to actually reclaim the temple and reclaim Jerusalem, and cleanse the temple. And so the temple was cleansed, and that was during the interregnum, which is the 400 years of silence between the last book of the Old Testament, Malachi, and the first book of the New Testament, Matthew. And of course, we know the story. We're going to get into that story as we enter the Christmas season. But the story of Hanukkah is very important to the story of Christmas. Jesus did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill the law completely. And so he was the only man that could fulfill the law. He's the only one that would have perfect works. He was the God-man. We're not saved by our own personal works, but we're saved by the perfect works of Jesus Christ, by the blood he shed on the cross at Calvary. And so he was the perfect Lamb of God, that perfect sacrifice. And so the fact is that when he was born, he was. They waited the 8 days, and then they do the circumcision. It's 8 days, right? 8 days, and they do a circumcision, and so then they offer him at the temple, and so the firstborn is offered. There's an offering that's made at the temple for the firstborn, And so Simeon and Anna had been waiting for the Messiah for many, many, many years, very patiently. And Anna had been, she was like 85, I think 85 years old. I think it was 85 years old. And she had been a widow for probably over 50 years. And she had been faithfully serving day and night in the temple, awaiting the arrival of the Messiah. And so when she saw the Messiah, she was full of glee. And Simeon too, that I can now go in peace because now I've seen my Messiah, the Lord Jesus Christ. And so the temple had to be cleansed, so he could perfectly fulfill the law, because that was one of the parts of the law he had to fulfill, is going to the temple and being dedicated at the temple. So that's it's kind of a little piece of the story. So I just wish you, I hope that you get a better idea of what Hannukah is, and if you're celebrating Hannukah, happy Hannukah, Hag Sameach, and a blessed holiday, and Merry Christmas as well. So thank you for joining us tonight.